You know, when we think of the Roaring Twenties, we often think of flappers and jazz. But at the exact same time, Black Americans were forging a brand new revolutionary identity. We're going to dive into how a generation, staring down just incredible hostility, literally created a new consciousness for itself, through art, through politics, and through pure, unyielding resilience.
To really get this story, you have to understand the ashes it rose from. Just let this sink in for a moment. In 1921, one of the wealthiest, most successful Black communities in the entire country was systematically burned to the ground by a white mob. And look, this wasn't some random, isolated event. This was the brutal reality of the time.
So, when you're faced with that kind of relentless, soul-crushing violence and oppression, what do? Where do you even begin? That's really the core question we're tackling today, and the answer, well, it wasn't about surrender. It was about a powerful, defiant reawakening. All right, so that brings us right into our first section, because it was out of the absolute horror of events like the Tulsa Race Massacre that this powerful new spark, this new sense of self and determination was ignited.
You have to understand, the hostility was just systemic. It was everywhere. You had the daily humiliation of Jim Crow laws, the constant terror of the lynching epidemic, and then you had these explosions of violence, like Tulsa. We're talking more than 30 city blocks of a thriving community just gone. Over 1,000 homes torched, hundreds of people killed. This was the pressure cooker that was about to forge something entirely new.
So what did people do? In response to all this violence and the total lack of opportunity in the South, millions of Black Americans started moving. They headed north in what we now call the Great Migration. And this massive movement created the perfect environment for what was to come, a new capital, really, for Black America.
Let's just look at the numbers for a second, because they're pretty wild. In 1910, New York City had a Black population of just over 91,000. Okay, a decent-sized community. But just watch what happens next.
By 1930, we're talking just 20 years later, that number explodes to over 327,000. This wasn't just a small shift. It was a monumental demographic quake that completely changed the fabric of the city and really the country. I mean, look at this chart. The growth is just staggering. You see a 257% increase in the Black population. Compare that to just 20% for the white population. This wasn't just growth. It was a tidal wave of people, of culture, of energy, and new ideas, all pouring into one place. And that one place was Harlem. This incredible concentration of people, all searching for a new life, turned this one neighborhood into what the writer James Weldon Johnson perfectly called the culture capital. It literally became the nerve center, the heartbeat for everything that was about to happen. But see, this migration wasn't just about changing your address. It was about changing your entire mindset. This was the moment of the rise of what became known as the New Negro. So what does that actually mean, the New Negro? This is so crucial. It was a conscious, deliberate rejection of all the old, demeaning stereotypes. Popularized by thinkers like Alain Locke, it was all about a new generation that was outspoken, that was self-reliant, and that was completely, unapologetically demanding its rights as American citizens. I just love this quote from Alain Locke, spiritual emancipation. It just nails the feeling, doesn't it? This was an internal revolution just as much as it was an external one. It was about shaking off the crushing psychological weight of centuries of oppression and claiming a new, proud identity from the inside out. So you have all this new energy, this new spirit. Where does it go? Well, it expressed itself in two major and, sometimes competing ways. One was through this incredible explosion of culture and the arts, and the other was through a radical new political consciousness. First, you've got the cultural boom of the Harlem Renaissance. And let's be clear, this wasn't just art for art's sake. This was a powerful declaration of humanity and self-worth. In just over a decade, writers are publishing dozens of novels and poetry collections exploring the true complexities of Black life. The raw improvisational energy of jazz becomes the soundtrack of the modern world, pouring out of clubs like the Cotton Club. And when Dixie to Broadway hits a mainstream stage, the first all-Black show to do so, it's a landmark moment. Every single painting, every poem, every performance was a defiant act of self-definition. Okay, so at the exact same time, you have this massive political movement bubbling up, Garveyism. Led by the incredibly charismatic Marcus Garvey, this movement was all about racial pride, economic independence, and Pan-Africanism, this idea of uniting Black people across the globe.
And he wasn't just talking. He built his organization, the UNIA, into the largest black nationalist organization in the world. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating, because you have these two fundamentally different philosophies running side by side. On one hand, you have the established NAACP. They believed in America's promise and focused on slow, methodical legal fights to make the system live up to its ideals. They worked with white allies, believing integration was the path forward. Garvey, on the other hand, totally different playbook. He saw the system as hopelessly corrupt. He rejected any reliance on white people, arguing for black economic independence and total separation. So while the NAACP was trying to reform the system from within, Garvey wanted to build a whole new one, which ultimately led to his Return to Africa plan. The NAACP called it surrender, but to his followers, it was the ultimate act of self-determination.
And Garvey's story is it's so dramatic. He builds this huge global organization. He even launches his own shipping company, the Black Star Line, to connect the diaspora. But his radical ideas made him a major target. He was attacked not just by the US government, but by other black leaders too, which eventually led to his imprisonment, on what many saw as trumped-up mail fraud charges, and then his deportation. But despite his downfall, his message was so incredibly powerful, and it just echoed. This simple rallying cry, "Up, you mighty race," perfectly captured that spirit of pride and dignity that he managed to instill in millions of people who had been told for centuries that they had none. So where does all this leave us? What's the lasting impact of these two massive movements, one cultural, one political? Well, let's take a look at the legacy they left behind.
The legacy is just undeniable. The Harlem Renaissance cemented its place as a cornerstone of black intellectual and cultural history. And Garveyism? It permanently changed black consciousness, both here and around the world. Garvey's ideas directly inspired future generations of activists. We're talking people like the parents of Malcolm X, and even African independence leaders like Ghana's very first president. The seeds that were planted in the 1920s were absolutely going to grow into the civil rights movements that came later.
And all of this leaves us with a really big final thought. The story of the new Negro gives us these two powerful models for change, right? You have the cultural explosion of the Harlem Renaissance, and you have the political radicalism of Marcus Garvey. It really makes you wonder, in the fight for justice and the fight for a new identity, what actually holds the greater power to change the world? Is it art or is it politics? Definitely something to think about.